Femi Gbajabiamila says he has never had any contact with Adeniyi Adeyemi, ever, in any form, direct or indirect. Adeyemi says they spoke 3 times by phone. Both of these statements cannot be true. That's just the first of 10 specific documented contradictions between these two men's accounts, and by the time we're done, you'll understand exactly where their stories conflict, why it matters, and which parts of this saga we can actually verify versus which parts remain a genuine, unresolved dispute. Before we go further, if you're new here, this channel exists for one reason: to give Nigerians the political and policy analysis mainstream media won't. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. 1. Did they ever have any contact at all? This is the foundational contradiction underlying everything else in this saga, and it remains genuinely unresolved. Femi Gbajabiamila's formal legal position, delivered through his lawyer Kemi Pinheiro SAN and reaffirmed in his 15 billion naira defamation suit filed in July 2026, is absolute. No contact whatsoever with Adeyemi, direct or through any intermediary, at any point. Adeyemi's account, given in his July 7th interview with Very Dark Man, is narrower but still directly contradicts that absolute denial. He says he never met Gbajabiamila physically, but that they spoke 3 separate times by phone, not video call, with those calls facilitated through his now deceased associate, Dolapo Tanimola. The reason this contradiction is so difficult to resolve independently is structural. The only 2 people who could confirm or deny these alleged calls are Adeyemi himself, whose credibility has been repeatedly undermined by his own shifting statements, and Tanimola, the alleged intermediary, who is deceased and cannot corroborate anything. This is not a contradiction this channel can resolve. What can be said is that these are not minor differences in emphasis. They are flatly incompatible accounts of a basic factual question. Did any communication occur at all? 2. Who actually appointed Adeyemi, if anyone did? Adeyemi's core claim, dating back to his original public allegations, is that Gbajabiamila personally appointed him as Director General of the PFIPC. Gbajabiamila's position, and the presidency's broader official framing, is that no such appointment was ever made by anyone in government, that the entire entity is fictitious, and that Adeyemi is, in the government's words, an impostor who forged his way into apparent legitimacy without genuine appointment by anyone. This contradiction sits alongside a genuinely inconvenient fact for the government's simplest version of events. The PFIPC had a real signed budget code 011106201 worth 1.303 billion naira in the 2026 Appropriation Act, and 314 staff positions were formally approved by the head of civil service. An entity with no genuine appointment, no real backing, and no institutional recognition does not typically acquire a federal budget line and hundreds of approved staff positions. This doesn't resolve who specifically appointed Adeyemi, but it does mean the simplest version of "he made the whole thing up alone" sits uneasily next to the documented institutional footprint the PFIPC actually had. 3. The bribery allegation itself. At his June 25th and 26th press conference, Adeyemi made a specific, detailed financial accusation that Gbajabiamila demanded 48% of PFIPC's claimed 27.4 billion naira takeoff grant, roughly 12.5 billion naira, and separately collected 400 million naira connected to facilitating the appointment. Gbajabiamila's July 2026 defamation suit formally and specifically denies this allegation in full, describing it as malicious, reckless, and entirely without factual foundation, and seeks 15 billion naira in damages specifically over this claim. This is the single most consequential contradiction in the entire saga, since it is the allegation now being formally tested through defamation litigation, Unlike the contact question, this allegation has a specific, theoretically verifiable financial trail attached to it: bank records, transaction histories, evidence of an actual 400 million naira payment or its absence. Which means this particular contradiction, unlike the first, may eventually be resolved through the legal process itself rather than remaining permanently unverifiable. 4. Adeyemi contradicting his own earlier certainty. This contradiction isn't between Adeyemi and Gbajabiamila directly, it's between Adeyemi and his own prior self. At his June press conference, Adeyemi spoke with apparent certainty, naming specific figures and describing a specific bribery arrangement in detail. By his July 7th interview, under direct questioning about whether Gbajabiamila was lying, Adeyemi's own words were markedly less certain. "I wouldn't say he is lying, and I wouldn't say he is saying the truth." This shift matters enormously for how the rest of his claims should be weighed. A man who stated specific bribery figures with confidence in June and then by July could no longer commit to whether his own central accusation was even true has himself introduced a contradiction that undermines his own credibility independent of anything Gbajabiamila has said. This happened notably in the roughly 72-hour window after Gbajabiamila's lawyer issued a formal cease and desist and defamation threat, a timing detail this channel's earlier coverage treated as significant context for interpreting the walkback. 5. What actually happened to Dolapo Tanimola? Adeyemi's account of Tanimola's death is specific and pointed. He has publicly questioned the absence of independent witnesses to the reported hotel fire that killed Tanimola, and noted that the hotel structure was demolished days later, a detail he has used to imply a possible cover-up connected to the broader scandal. No official government account has confirmed any connection between Tanimola's death and the PFIPC affair, and no independent investigation result has been publicly reported establishing foul play. This is a contradiction between an unverified allegation and an absence of confirming or denying official information, rather than a direct contradiction between two competing named accounts. It remains one of the most serious and least resolved threads in this entire saga. A man is dead, the circumstances remain publicly murky, and this channel has consistently declined to speculate about causation beyond what Adeyemi himself has alleged, since doing so would mean treating an entirely uncorroborated claim as though it carried more evidentiary weight than it currently does. 6. Lone impostor versus a budget code and 314 staff. The presidency's earliest public framing described Adeyemi as a lone impostor acting entirely alone, who forged his way to apparent legitimacy without any institutional assistance. This account sits in direct tension with two documented facts this channel has verified independently: the PFIPC's real signed federal budget code worth 1.303 billion naira and 314 staff positions formally approved by the Office of the Head of the Civil Service. A single individual acting entirely alone with no institutional assistance does not typically succeed in getting a fictitious entity a real line in a signed national budget and hundreds of approved civil service positions. This isn't a contradiction between Adeyemi and Gbajabiamila specifically. It's a contradiction within the government's own early public narrative, and it is a contradiction the government itself eventually resolved by changing its own story, which brings us to the next point. 7. The government's own story changed from lone impostor to internal collaborators. By July 2026, presidential sources were telling reporters directly that internal collaborators must have enabled Adeyemi to get as far as he did, a direct contradiction of the earlier lone impostor framing. President Tinubu directed the ICPC to investigate specifically with the goal of identifying these collaborators, giving the commission a 30-day mandate.
This is arguably the most institutionally significant contradiction on this entire list because it is not a dispute between two individuals with competing incentives to lie. It is the government's own account changing over time under the weight of facts like the budget code and staffing approvals that the earlier simpler narrative could not adequately explain. As of this recording, despite that admission being made publicly, no internal collaborator has been named, a gap this channel has flagged repeatedly as the single most important unresolved accountability thread in this story.
8. The video evidence that helped Adeyemi's case then hurt it. This contradiction is more subtle and unfolded entirely within Adeyemi's own defense strategy rather than between him and Gbajabiamila directly, but it's genuinely instructive. On July 6, 2026, Adeyemi's associate Deji Adeyanju tendered a video of President Tinubu stating that Nigerians have the right to criticize and even insult him. This was treated, including in this channel's own earlier coverage, as a potentially significant piece of evidence. But on July 13, 2023, under cross-examination, Adeyanju himself conceded that Tinubu never said the law shouldn't take its course when someone actually breaks it, a concession that directly narrows the video's usefulness as a defense, since it allows exactly the argument the prosecution needs, that tolerating criticism is different from excusing unlawful conduct. The same piece of evidence that looked like a strong point in Adeyemi's favor on July 6th had been meaningfully weakened by his own witness's testimony within a week. 9. I fear for my life versus a 5-day surveillance operation. On July 13, 2026, Adeyemi wrote to President Tinubu claiming verified, highly reliable intelligence that he would be targeted for elimination the moment he surfaced in any unmonitored environment. Less than 24 hours later, police arrested him, having tracked him through 5 full days of DSS surveillance, meaning his exact location had already been known and monitored well before that letter was even written. This is a contradiction between the narrative Adeyemi's letter constructs of a man in genuine, acute, imminent danger who needed to warn the president urgently, and the documented reality that his security agencies already had full visibility on his location for nearly a week before that letter was even written. This channel's own prior analysis concluded these two events were parallel developments rather than cause and effect, but the letter's framing of urgency doesn't sit comfortably next to the reality that his whereabouts were already thoroughly known. 10. The loan figure keeps changing. Even a detail as seemingly simple as how much money Adeyemi borrowed to secure his appointment has shifted across reporting. Some early headlines referenced a figure of roughly 100 million naira. More recent, more directly sourced reporting has him stating he borrowed 400 million naira, with his lenders subsequently reporting him to the EFCC after failing to be repaid. On its own, this might be dismissed as simple reporting inconsistency rather than a meaningful contradiction, but taken alongside the other 9 points on this list, a pattern emerges. Specific, checkable numeric details in Adeyemi's own account, the bribery percentage, the loan amount, the nature of his contact with Gbajabiamila have shifted or softened at multiple points throughout this saga. That pattern doesn't prove any specific claim is false. It does mean that treating any single account from either man as a fixed, unchanging story requires acknowledging how much of it has actually moved over time. 10 contradictions. And by design, this video hasn't told you who's telling the truth. It couldn't, honestly, not on most of these points. What it has done is show you exactly where these two accounts, and in some cases, each man's or each institution's own account over time, actually conflict in specific, checkable, sourced detail rather than vague suspicion. Some of these contradictions may eventually be resolved through the courts, the defamation suit specifically, and the ICPC investigation. Others, particularly what actually happened to Dolapo Tanimola, may never be fully resolved at all. Both possibilities are worth sitting with honestly, rather than picking a side prematurely because one man's story feels more compelling than the others.
Which of these 10 surprised you most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want full, deeper context behind any of these, this channel has covered this saga from the very beginning. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what's really happening. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.